Forget everything you think you know about the Knights Templar. The Crusader warriors draped in white cloaks with crimson crosses, famed for their legendary treasure and secret rites. Behind that symbol lies something deeper, darker, the story of the Merovingian bloodline. A lineage erased from official history, yet still leaving faint traces in symbols, in power, and perhaps in those who shape the fate of Europe today. Here at Bedtime History, we open the door to a past you were never taught, a history of things never meant to be spoken aloud. To understand the Merovingian story, we must begin where history and legend blur into one. Gaul in the 5th century was a chaotic mosaic. The Western Roman Empire crumbling to dust, Germanic tribes flooding in from the north and east, and barbarian kingdoms shifting rulers like the wind. It was in this turbulent setting that a name began to echo through the earliest chronicles. Meave is regarded as the founder of the Merovingian dynasty and the source of a strange legend that has endured for over 1,000 years. According to the historian Gregory of Tours and fragments of folk tradition, Meave was not merely the son of King Clai, a Frankish warlord, but carried within him something otherworldly. The tale tells that while the queen was pregnant, she went down to the sea and encountered a mysterious creature known as the Kinotar, the 5-horned sea beast. No one knows exactly what transpired, only that she returned from that meeting to give birth to Miavek. From that moment, the Merovingian bloodline was believed to be a union of man and a force from the deep, an emblem of divine power and the protection of the gods. In the medieval world, where Christian belief and older pagan traditions still mingled, such a story was not dismissed as fantasy. On the contrary, it became a foundation for legitimizing Merovingian rule. If a king carried the blood of the divine, his right to reign came not only from victory in battle, but from a mandate beyond mortal reach, a decree no earthly rival could challenge. This was the core of the sacred king concept the Merovingians upheld for generations. The mark of the sacred king was not confined to the myth of his birth. Merovingian rulers wore their hair long as a visible seal of untouchable authority. Among the Franks, that hair was believed to embody a ruler's strength and his bond with the divine. To cut a king's hair was to strip him of legitimacy and banish him from the throne forever. Royal ceremonies therefore guarded the king's hair with almost religious care, making it a living symbol of lawful rule. Another emblem, the honeybee, symbol of immortality and cosmic order, appeared in many Merovingian artifacts. In ancient symbolism, bees bridged the human and divine realms, representing a society bound together by loyalty and strict order. This was no idle choice. It was a deliberate statement that the Merovingian realm was built on a sacred order that could not be broken. The legend of Miavek, along with these sacred symbols, allowed the Merovingians to stand apart from other royal houses of the time. In a Europe still fractured and volatile, they emerged as a dynasty that combined military power with an otherworldly mark that inspired awe and fear among rival tribes. This became the bedrock of their rise under Clovis I, when their authority was secured not only with iron swords, but with the unshakable belief that they had been chosen by destiny to rule. Yet the power of a legend lies not only in whether it is believed in its own time, but in its ability to endure and adapt through the shifting tides of history. And the story of Meave would follow his descendants through the Merovingian golden centuries, an age when they stood as one of the great pillars of Western Europe until the first cracks of decline began to appear. If Meave was the name that sparked the legend, Clovis the Phi was the man who transformed that legend into a political and military powerhouse. Ascending the throne in 481 at just 15 years old, Clovis inherited a small Frankish realm surrounded by formidable rivals, other Germanic tribes, remnants of the Roman military, and independent territories across Gaul. In such a volatile landscape, survival required more than swords and spears. It demanded a bold strategy to expand his power far beyond the lands his father had left him. Clovis's most decisive move came during what might have seemed like just another tribal clash, the Battle of Tolbiac in 496 Alamian against the Alemanni. According to legend, as the tide of battle turned against him, Clovis prayed to the god of his wife, Princess Clotilde, a devout Catholic, that if victory were granted, he would convert to Christianity. Clovis emerged victorious, and he kept his word. The conversion that followed was not merely an act of faith, it was one of the most astute political decisions in post-Roman European history. By embracing Catholicism, Clovis aligned himself with the Roman Church, the only institution at the time whose influence and network transcended the borders of kingdoms. This alliance gave him two major advantages. First, legitimacy. Clovis was no longer just a tribal warlord, but a Christian king recognized by the church, placing him on equal or even superior footing compared to the Arian rulers of the day. Second, political and military support. Bishops and Catholic leaders throughout Gaul saw Clovis as a natural ally, ready to back him in consolidating his authority. After his conversion, Clovis rapidly expanded his realm, conquering strategic territories across Gaul and uniting the Frankish tribes. He chose Paris as his new capital, transforming it into both a political center and a symbol of unity. Under his rule, the Franks' first codified legal system, the Lex Salica, was established, blending tribal traditions with Roman legal principles and laying a stable foundation for governance that would outlast him. Clovis's alliance with the church also reinforced the Merovingians' image as sacred kings. If Mieve's legend tied them to myth and supernatural power, Clovis brought that image into the framework of Christianity, transforming divine authority into a blend of sacred bloodline and God's grace. This was a rare formula, preserving tribal identity while integrating into the emerging religious and political order of Europe. When Clovis died in 511, he left his descendants not only a vast kingdom stretching from the Pyrenees to the Rhine, but also a durable political and religious foundation. Yet within that legacy lay the seeds of future division. His lands were split among his sons, each ruling a portion, yet all belonging to the Merovingian line. In the short term, this preserved family unity. In the long term, it created fractures the dynasty would one day pay dearly for. And as with all dynasties, the Golden Age would not last forever. After Clovis, the Merovingians would see decades of prosperity, but also periods of fragmentation, until the moment came when real power began to slip from the hands of kings into those of others, men who would change the dynasty's fate forever. After the death of Clovis Thirst, the Frankish kingdom was divided among his 4 sons, following the Frankish custom of partible inheritance. This was not intended as a permanent fracture, but as a way to ensure that each branch of the royal family retained its own territory and authority while still belonging to a single bloodline, the Merovingian line. In its early years, this system functioned relatively well. The brothers, though occasionally at war with one another, maintained a shared sense of heritage, especially when confronted by outside threats. By this time, Merovingian territory stretched across nearly all of Gaul, from the Atlantic coast to the Alps and the Rhine, encompassing resource-rich lands and vital trade routes. They held key cities such as Paris, Metz, Soissons, Orléans, and Tours, each serving as both an administrative center and a religious hub. Across the kingdom, new churches, monasteries, and royal residences were constructed not merely for governance, but to project authority to both the populace and the nobility. What set the Merovingian dynasty apart in this era was their ability to blend tribal tradition with a Roman-influenced administrative framework. Regions were governed by royal family members or trusted officials, yet remained under the coordination of a central authority. This arrangement allowed them to adapt quickly to local challenges while keeping the kingdom under unified control. For the 6th and 7th centuries, this was an astute form of governance, decentralized enough to be flexible, yet cohesive enough to preserve stability over a vast domain. While neighboring kingdoms often relied solely on military might, the Merovingian rulers wielded symbols and ritual as instruments of power. Chief among these was the king's long hair, a distinctive mark separating him from his subjects and imbued with sacred significance. It was believed that this hair was bound to his strength and legitimacy. To cut it was to strip him of his right to rule, a symbolic act of deposition that required no bloodshed. Alongside the long hair, the honeybee became another emblem of the dynasty, depicted on jewelry, insignia, and ceremonial objects. In ancient symbolism, the bee represented immortality, order, and discipline, qualities the Merovingian kings sought to weave into their image of rule. Choosing the bee as a royal emblem was a deliberate statement. Their reign was part of a divinely maintained cosmic order. Yet the very system of partible inheritance that had allowed them to govern such a vast realm carried within it the seeds of future trouble. As new generations came to power, the number of heirs multiplied, overlapping marriage alliances bred rivalries, and personal ambition could easily erupt into internal conflict. For a long time, the Merovingian dynasty had the strength to keep these tensions from tearing the kingdom apart, but the first cracks had begun to show. The Merovingian Golden Age was therefore both a pinnacle of power and a period when the roots of decline were quietly taking hold. Their symbols of authority, the long hair and the honeybee, still commanded awe, but soon they would be tested by forces not only from beyond their borders, but from within their own bloodline. And when real power began to slip from the king's hands, these symbols, once protectors of the throne, stood as reminders of a sovereignty that was becoming more ceremonial than real. The 7th century marked a quiet but decisive shift in the balance of power within the Frankish kingdom. On the surface, the Merovingian throne still glittered with its sacred rituals and symbols. The king still wore his long hair, still claimed descent from the divine blood of Meovk, and still stood at the center of royal ceremony. But behind this facade, real authority had begun to slip from the hands of the royal family. The key figures in this transformation were the mayors of the palace. At first, this position was little more than a household office, managing the royal estates, overseeing finances, and assisting the king in day-to-day governance. Over time, however, especially as kings became preoccupied with ceremonial duties or distracted by family feuds, the mayors gradually evolved into the kingdom's true administrators. From mere aides, they came to command armies, control the treasury, and forge political alliances. They decided questions of war and peace, appointed officials, and negotiated with the church. In effect, the Merovingian king had become more of a symbolic figurehead, while the real levers of power rested in the hands of appointed officials who held no sacred bloodline. Among these, the Pippinid family rose above all others. Through strategic marriages and military prowess, they secured their dominance over key territories such as Austrasia, a resource-rich eastern region with vital military importance. Over successive generations, from Pippin of Landen to Pippin of Herstal, the Pippinids expanded their reach far beyond the palace, becoming de facto rulers in their own right. The true turning point came with Charles Martel, the illegitimate son of Pippin of Herstal, who cemented his family's authority through his victory at the Battle of Tours in 732, halting the Muslim advance into Western Europe and securing his position not only in the Frankish realm, but across Christian Europe. Though he never took the title of king, Charles Martel embodied the complete reversal of royal power. He ruled without the crown, while the Merovingian king existed only in name. After Charles Martel, his son Pippin the Short inherited the office of mayor and pushed the transition to its final stage. With the support of Pope Zachary, Pippin posed a calculated question: who should be king, the one who merely holds the title or the one who truly wields the power? The answer paved the way for one of the most unprecedented depositions in Frankish history. The decline of Merovingian authority was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow erosion over decades. The sacred symbols remained intact, but the throne had long been hollow. And when the moment came, it took only a single well-played political move to strip away the outer shell and reveal a reality that had existed for years. The Merovingians had lost their power long before they lost their crown. When Childeric III took the throne in 743, the Merovingian crown was already an empty seat of power. He was not the true ruler of the Frankish kingdom, but a ceremonial figure maintained to preserve the illusion that the dynasty of the sacred kings still endured. Real authority rested entirely in the hands of Pippin the Short, mayor of the palace, son of Charles Martel, and the man who ran the machinery of the state. For 8 years, Childeric III played his role, appearing at royal ceremonies, issuing charters drafted by the mayor's scribes, and doing whatever was necessary to keep the facade of Merovingian kingship intact. Yet even as a figurehead, his presence remained an obstacle to Pippin's ambitions. To legitimize his rule, Pippin needed more than the title of mayor. He needed the crown itself. In 750, Pippin sent a pointed question to Pope Zachary: who should be king, the one who holds the title without power, or the one who actually governs? The Pope's reply, reportedly direct and unequivocal, gave Pippin the opening he needed. Authority and title should belong to the same person. It was both a religious and political sanction for an unprecedented act, deposing a lawful king in favor of the palace's chief minister. In 751, at Soissons, a council of nobles and clergy assembled. Childeric III was declared deposed. There was no uprising, no battle. The last Merovingian king was quietly taken into custody, and the act of deposition came in the form of ritual humiliation. His long hair, the sacred symbol of Frankish royal legitimacy, was cut away. This gesture did more than strip him of his kingship. It severed the dynasty's claim to divine authority. After the ceremony, Childeric III was sent to the monastery of Sithiu, later St. Bertin, where he spent the rest of his life in silence and obscurity. No record suggests resistance or any attempt to reclaim the throne. For him, the dynasty ended not with a catastrophic war, but with a political decision wrapped in ritual and endorsed by the most powerful forces of the age. This moment marked the official end of the Merovingian dynasty. After more than 2 centuries, the Carolingian line of Pippin the Short took its place, ushering in a new era for the Frankish realm. Yet the almost gentle, undramatic nature of the transition left behind an unsettling question. How could a dynasty that claimed sacred blood vanish so quietly? Had their power already been hollowed out long before? Or did they willingly retreat into the shadows to safeguard something more important than the throne? That question would become the seed of centuries of speculation, linking the Merovingians to secret networks of power and to the most famous of medieval orders, the Knights Templar, who would emerge centuries later and be suspected of guarding the legacy of the sacred kings. The deposition of Childeric III in 751 was more than a dynastic change. It marked the beginning of a systematic campaign to erase the Merovingians from collective memory. In the centuries that followed, histories commissioned by the Carolingian dynasty and written by church-affiliated chroniclers reduced the Merovingians' role to near irrelevance, portraying them as inept rulers, the so-called rois faineants, or do-nothing kings, who enjoyed privilege without governing. In truth, this downgrading was less an objective judgment than a political tool. The new dynasty needed to justify its seizure of the crown, and the best way to do so was to recast their predecessors as symbols of decline. By painting the Merovingians as weak and incompetent, the Carolingians not only strengthened their own legitimacy, but made the transfer of power appear both necessary and inevitable. The result was a vast hollowing out of the historical record. Many contemporary accounts of the Merovingian period vanished entirely or survived only in fragments. Official chronicles omitted or downplayed evidence of their actual power, focusing instead on anecdotes that reinforced the image of decadence. Monastic archives, custodians of the era's memory, restricted access to key documents, and over time, some were lost, destroyed, or allowed to decay. Within the silence of official history, the Merovingians slipped into legend. The tale of Merovec and his mystical origins lived on in local folklore, whispered in the very lands they once ruled. Their symbols, the honeybee and the long hair, still surfaced occasionally in art and architecture, no longer explicitly linked to the dynasty, yet still recognizable to those who knew what to look for. These gaps in the record became fertile ground for imagination, giving rise to theories that persist into the modern age. If mainstream history had erased much of the Merovingian legacy, could there still be documents, genealogies, or relics proving they never truly vanished, but merely withdrew into the shadows? In this telling, the Merovingians became the centerpiece of an undercurrent in history, where stories of the chosen bloodline and hidden power passed quietly through the generations. At times entwined with groups like the Knights Templar, being erased from the political stage does not always mean the end of a dynasty. Sometimes it marks the transformation of power into a subtler, more elusive form. And when darkness blankets the official record, those who seek the truth are left to follow the faintest of trails, a carved emblem on stone, a blurred line in a manuscript, or a local legend whose origin no one quite remembers. It is from this fog of forgotten history that centuries later a new force would emerge, knightly in form, yet bound by its own network of power and secrecy. Many believe that this force inherited and guarded what remained of the Merovingian legacy. This was the moment when the Knights Templar stepped onto the stage of history. Nearly 4 centuries after the Merovingian dynasty vanished from the political stage, Europe entered the era of the Crusades, a period shaped as much by religious fervor as by the grand game of politics and economics. In 1096, Pope Urban II's call to arms ignited waves of crusading armies from across the Christian kingdoms, their goal to reclaim the holy city of Jerusalem from Muslim control. The First Crusade ended in 1099 with a Christian victory, establishing the Kingdom of Jerusalem and other Crusader states. But victory did not bring peace. The pilgrimage route from Europe to the Holy Land remained fraught with danger. Bands of faithful merchants and emissaries still had to cross wild and hostile lands, vulnerable to ambush, robbery, and slaughter. In this climate, a small band of knights swore an oath to defend pilgrims with their lives. In 1119, Hugues de Payens and 8 companions founded the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, later known simply as the Knights Templar. At first, they were far from a mighty force, numbering fewer than 10 members, living under strict vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Yet from the moment of their founding, they received extraordinary favor. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem granted them quarters in part of his royal palace, built on the site of the ancient Temple of Solomon. For Christendom, this was a place of unparalleled sanctity, bound to the legacy of King Solomon and the First Temple. A location heavy with both spiritual and symbolic weight, to be housed in one of the most sacred sites in Jerusalem was more than an honor. It was an opportunity. Beneath this site lay vaults and tunnels, many untouched since the days of Roman and Islamic rule. For nearly a decade, the Templars occupied these quarters, engaging in activities largely absent from official records, a shadowy gap in the historical narrative that has fueled centuries of speculation. One of the most enduring theories suggests that during this time, the Templars uncovered relics and ancient documents capable of reshaping the understanding of Christian history and European authority, possibly including evidence of the Merovingian bloodline, survival, and legitimacy. If so, the Templars would have transformed from pilgrim knights into guardians of a secret with influence far beyond the battlefield or the halls of the church. Only a few years after their founding, the Templars were formally recognized by Pope Honorius II, who granted them extraordinary privileges, exemption from taxes, independence from secular rulers, and direct accountability only to the Pope himself. These freedoms laid the foundation for their rapid rise into a formidable military and financial power spanning Europe and the Middle East, with a vast network of fortresses, banking operations, and trade routes. Yet it was their unique position at the Temple of Solomon and the unanswered questions about what they found there that forever bound the Templars to a dense web of myths and conspiracies. Among these, the alleged connection to the Merovingians would prove to be one of the most persistent and haunting threads, echoing through legend into the present day. The decade the Knights Templar spent quartered at the site of the Temple of Solomon, from 1119 to roughly 1129, remains one of the darkest and most hotly debated chapters in the order's history. Official records tell us almost nothing of their activities during this period, aside from the statement that they were protecting pilgrims. Yet, given what we know of their original size, only about 9 men, it would have been nearly impossible for them to safeguard hundreds of miles of treacherous road. That practical impossibility has fueled centuries of speculation about what their true mission may have been beneath the Temple Mount. A handful of indirect sources from the 12th and 13th centuries hint that the Templars undertook excavations and surveys in the ancient tunnels beneath the site. These subterranean passages were thought to be remnants of structures from the era of King Solomon, or at the very least from the periods of Roman and Byzantine control over Jerusalem. In medieval imagination, the temple was not only sacred ground, but also a storeroom of unimaginable wealth and ancient wisdom, housing sacred relics and religious manuscripts of immense spiritual value. From this gap in the record emerged the most enduring theory that the Templars uncovered documents and evidence capable of shaking the political and religious order of Europe. One branch of this theory ties their discoveries directly to the Merovingian dynasty. According to it, the Templars may have found genealogies, sacred texts, or bloodline evidence linking the Merovingians to central figures of early Christianity, possibly even to Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. If true, this would recast the Merovingians not as a dethroned medieval house, but as the chosen bloodline with a claim strong enough to challenge the legitimacy of reigning dynasties and even the authority of the church itself. Oral traditions from southern France, once a Merovingian stronghold, tell of the Templars transporting large wooden chests from Jerusalem back to Europe, hiding them within fortified strongholds, particularly in the regions of Languedoc and Aragon. Modern researchers note that several Templar fortresses in these areas were either constructed or heavily reinforced soon after their return from the Holy Land, as if to guard something of extraordinary value. Though no archaeological proof has surfaced to confirm the theory, the Templars' sudden rise in wealth and influence after their time at the Temple Mount continues to fuel suspicion. Their treasure may not have been gold or jewels at all, but knowledge. And in politics and religion, a secret can wield more power than any fortune. If the Templars truly held proof of the Merovingian bloodline's legitimacy, then their later privileges, direct papal protection, exemption from secular law, become easier to understand. Yet such a secret would also make them a latent threat to kings and popes alike. And as history would later prove, in the ruthless world of medieval power, holding a dangerous truth could be as fatal as any defeat on the battlefield. After leaving Jerusalem and securing papal recognition in the early 12th century, the Knights Templar began constructing one of the most extensive and sophisticated power networks of the medieval world. At first, they were famed as an elite military order, but within decades, they had evolved into a multifunctional institution, at once an army, a banking system, and a continent-spanning logistical network across Europe and the Middle East. They built hundreds of formidable fortresses, from massive strongholds like Crac des Chevaliers in Syria to strategically placed fortifications in Languedoc, Aragon, and Portugal. Each fortress served not only as a military base, but also as an administrative hub, a granary, and at times a secure repository for objects of unknown but suspected significance. In France, particularly in the south, once a Merovingian heartland, many Templar sites were constructed or reinforced shortly after their return from the Temple of Solomon. This timing has led some researchers to wonder whether these were stone vaults intended to safeguard whatever legacy they had uncovered. But the Templars' power was never solely in their swords and walls. They pioneered Europe's first transnational banking network. Pilgrims and merchants could deposit funds at a Templar preceptory in Paris and withdraw them in Acre or Antioch using encrypted letters of credit. This innovation offered unprecedented safety and speed in an era when overland travel was rife with danger. The system gave the Templars control over vast financial flows, enabling them to lend to kings and popes alike, securing in return protection, favors, and rare exemptions from secular authority. Within the theories linking them to the Merovingians, this network took on an additional role, protecting individuals believed to be descendants of the sacred kings. With their papal immunity and the ability to cross borders unchecked, the Templars could shelter and move key figures, along with documents or relics tied to them, beyond the reach of hostile powers. Some esoteric writings claim that through the Templars, a branch of the Merovingian bloodline survived, quietly absorbed into the European nobility and maintaining influence in the shadows for centuries. The order also preserved an internal system of symbols and rites that some scholars see as a subtle homage to Merovingian heritage. The iconic red cross would at times appear alongside motifs of the honeybee or the fleur-de-lis, symbols once associated with the ancient Frankish dynasty. While no official record explains this connection, their recurring presence in Templar architecture, heraldry, and manuscripts suggests a coded language understood only by those within the circle. Taken together, fortified strongholds, financial dominance, political autonomy, and unmatched mobility, the Templars became a force no king or pope could fully control. Yet it was precisely these strengths, combined with the suspicion that they guarded secrets capable of rewriting history, that made them an existential threat to the established order. And in the medieval world, any organization that amassed such wealth, independence, and dangerous knowledge rarely met a peaceful end. In the Middle Ages, when books were rare treasures and most of the population could not read, imagery and architecture were more than decoration. They were a language. The Knights Templar, with their vast network of fortresses, churches, and commanderies across Europe, mastered this language. Sometimes it served the church's official message, but at other times it carried a subtler purpose, messages that only a select few could decipher. In the theories linking them to the Merovingians, it was through this hidden language of stone and stained glass that the memory of the chosen bloodline was preserved. Symbolic researchers have identified recurring motifs across many Templar sites. The Red Cross, the order's official emblem, sometimes appears alongside depictions of honeybees or the fleur-de-lis, both closely tied to Merovingian heraldry and heritage. In certain churches, columns and arches bear carved wave patterns or fish, recalling the legend of Meovidt and his mysterious sea-born origin. To the casual eye, these were artistic flourishes. To those who knew the story, they were deliberate markers of a royal bloodline. Stained glass, a hallmark of Templar churches, also conceals its share of anomalies. Some windows depict crowned kings with flowing hair down to their shoulders, distinct from the styles of contemporary monarchs, yet without any identifying names. In the background, one might find bees or subtle six-pointed stars, faint enough to avoid suspicion, but clear to anyone searching for them. Architecture itself became a form of cipher. Many Templar fortresses and churches were built in circular or octagonal shapes, forms associated with perfection and eternity, but which some scholars interpret as symbols of the meeting point between the earthly and the divine. When plotted on a map, certain Templar sites appear to align in straight lines or form geometric shapes connecting historical Merovingian centers. as if the entire Templar network doubled as a memory map carved onto the landscape. If such symbols appeared only once or twice, they might be dismissed as coincidence. But their repetition over centuries and across a broad geography lends weight to the theory of dual symbolism. In this view, the Templars served their public role as the Church's military and financial arm while quietly pursuing another mission: preserving the Merovingian story in a medium no king or pope could easily censor or destroy. Through architecture and art, the Merovingian legacy needed no parchment to survive. It could hide in a carved relief, a stained glass window, or the hidden axis between buildings. Things seen by all, but read only by those with the key. And because such language was silent, it endured, slipping past inquisitions, purges, and the iron grip of official history. Yet while symbols could outlast centuries, political power could not. As the Templar network reached its peak, their independence and strength began to alarm both monarchs and the papacy. And when that unease turned into action, whatever legacy they had protected, if it truly existed, would face its greatest trial. As one crusade followed another, the Knights Templar became an indispensable force in the medieval Christian world. They were not only the spearhead of military campaigns, but also the backbone of the logistical, transport, and financial systems that sustained the conquest and control of the Holy Land. Their reach extended from European ports like La Rochelle and Marseille, through the fortified island of Cyprus, to the great strongholds of Acre and Antioch, all the way to frontline outposts such as Gaza and Safed. With each new crusade, the Templars carried more than swords and lances. They carried an entire trade network. They organized the shipment of grain, weapons, and supplies, as well as luxury goods such as spices, silks, and glassware from the East to Europe. This position made them cultural and technological conduits, absorbing the fortified building techniques of the Byzantine and Islamic worlds, learning advanced medical practices, mathematics, navigation, and even refined systems of administration. This gave them two decisive strategic advantages. First, their military and financial strength multiplied. Templar fortresses became the most advanced defensive works of their time, and their banking network allowed armies to operate for extended campaigns without relying entirely on the treasuries of kings. Second, their trade network functioned as a covert communications channel. Letters, documents, and even artifacts could travel thousands of miles under the protection of the Red Cross banner, a passport few would dare to violate. In the context of the Merovingian theory, this created the perfect mechanism for safeguarding and maintaining any legacy or secret the Templars might have acquired from their time beneath the Temple of Solomon. Genealogical records, symbolic relics, or even living individuals, if such things existed, could have been transported along Templar-controlled routes between continents without leaving a trace in official history. Their economic, military, and intellectual activities elevated them far beyond the role of a mere religious order. They became a supranational power, not wholly dependent on any single monarch or pope, with resources rivaling those of entire kingdoms. In many regions, Templar authority overshadowed local governance, as they controlled not only land but also the movement of wealth and strategically vital information. Yet it was precisely this vast network and independence that planted the seeds of their downfall. When an organization grows wealthy, militarily formidable, and holds secrets that other powers cannot access or control, suspicion and envy inevitably follow, along with the determination to destroy. Still, before that reckoning came, the Templars ensured their legacy was deeply entrenched. And if the theory of their Merovingian connection holds any truth, it was during the height of their influence that they secured the secret would not die with their order. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, a secret order was carried out simultaneously across the entire realm of France. King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, commanded the arrest of every Knight Templar within his borders. From the streets of Paris to the most remote countryside, Templar fortresses were surrounded, church doors sealed, and knights, from senior commanders to humble gatekeepers, were dragged away in irons. In a single night, an order once regarded as a pillar of Western Christendom was recast as an enemy of the faith. Officially, the charges were heresy, blasphemy, idol worship, and the performance of profane rituals. Yet, even at the time, many doubted these accusations were anything more than a pretext. In truth, Philip IV was drowning in debt, much of it owed to the Templar treasury, which had financed his wars. The purge allowed him not only to erase his debts, but also to seize the immense wealth and property the order controlled within France. But money may have been only part of the story. The Merovingian theory suggests that Philip IV and his allies, including Pope Clement V, himself heavily influenced by the French crown, sought to eliminate another threat, the secrets the Templars guarded. If the order truly held documents or proof validating the legitimacy of a chosen bloodline, such as the Merovingians, that knowledge could have destabilized both the Church's authority and the dynasties then ruling Europe. The sweep was ruthless. Many knights were tortured into confessing crimes that later historians have judged to be absurd or clearly fabricated. High-ranking leaders, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay, were imprisoned for years before being burned at the stake in 1314. According to legend, as the flames consumed him, de Molay cursed both Philip and Clement, and by strange coincidence, both men were dead within a year. Yet the purge left behind a mystery that has never been resolved. Most of the Templar treasure and records were never recovered. Contemporary accounts hint that in the hours before the arrests, certain members departed Paris with large wooden chests and vanished without a trace. Ever since, historians and treasure hunters alike have asked the same question. Did they flee with gold and silver, or with secrets powerful enough to upend the medieval world? The events of Friday the 13th, 1307, have since become a symbol of betrayal and political conspiracy. They ended the Templars' public existence. But if the Merovingian connection is real, they may also have driven what they protected deeper underground. History suggests that the body of an order can be destroyed while its core, its network, its knowledge, its purpose, survives in another form. From this point forward, the Templars, or at least their inner circle, would move into a new phase, hidden from the light, yet still casting a long shadow over Europe for centuries to come. After the Purge of 1307, many believed the Knights Templar had vanished entirely. In truth, it was only the end of the visible, public part of the order. The Templars' military and administrative structure in France was dismantled, their fortresses seized, their wealth confiscated. Yet the vast network they had built over more than 2 centuries, land holdings, manpower, alliances with noble houses, and intricate channels of information could not be erased in a single night. In kingdoms beyond the immediate reach of Philip IV, the Templars' fate was less severe. In Scotland, Portugal, and parts of Germany, many knights found refuge. In Portugal, the entire Templar branch was reborn under a new name, the Order of Christ, and continued to hold much of the old order's property, personnel, and rights, many of which were believed to be direct inheritances from the Templars. In Scotland, where the king refused to enforce the papal order, fugitive knights were sheltered by local lords, and legend holds that they fought in decisive battles such as Bannockburn in 1314. As for their symbols, the Templars' Red Cross disappeared from public banners but persisted in subtler forms, carved into church stonework, inlaid into floor tiles, or hidden within illuminated manuscripts. Certain dual symbols once linked to the Merovingians, the honeybee, the fleur-de-lis, the wave motif, continued to appear in noble heraldry, in the architecture of later buildings, and even in the rituals of secret societies that emerged centuries later. Some theories suggest that the Templars' inner circle, those who held the order's true secrets and legacy, deliberately retreated into the shadows before the purge began. The disappearance of large wooden chests from Paris just before Friday the 13th lends weight to the idea that part of the treasure was spirited away to safety. If the Merovingian theory is correct, what they safeguarded was not simply gold or silver, but documents, genealogies, or relics tied to the sacred king's bloodline. From the 14th century onward, the Templars' name became wrapped in legend. In popular tales, they were guardians of buried treasure, hidden vaults, and voyages to distant lands. In esoteric circles, they were cast as keepers of ancient knowledge, passing it down through later secret societies such as the Freemasons or the Priory of Sion. Whatever the truth, one thing is clear. The Templars, at least their legacy, did not vanish, but instead transformed to survive in a new world where hidden power could at times outweigh the visible. And like a closed circle, the memory of the Merovingians, if indeed preserved by them, followed the same path, erased from official histories, yet lingering in symbols, rituals, and whispered traditions. From this point on, the story belonged not just to a dynasty or an order of knights, but to the deeper current of European history, a current that now and then rises to the surface to remind the world of a power never entirely forgotten. When official history nearly erased the role of the Merovingians, their memory survived not in royal libraries or church archives, but in the quiet channels of oral tradition, symbols, and carefully concealed rituals. In regions that had once been their realm, especially in southern France, the story of the long-haired kings continued to be told, sometimes as a fireside legend, sometimes as a distorted fragment of history passed down through generations. Villagers spoke of a special bloodline that had once ruled and was later betrayed, its descendants still living among ordinary people, their identity hidden. These tales often came with subtle identifying marks, an old coat of arms featuring a honeybee, a family with unusually long hair, or a strange symbol carved into a church doorway with no official explanation. To outsiders, these were simply quaint bits of local folklore. To those who understood, they were fragments of a much larger story. In esoteric circles, the Merovingian memory was preserved more systematically. Certain secret societies, rumored to be spiritual heirs or direct successors of the Knights Templar, maintained symbolic rites connected to the chosen bloodline. Their ceremonies might reenact the coronation of a Merovingian king, incorporate the honeybee or fleur-de-lis into their regalia, or recite passages that hinted at the dynasty's supernatural origins. The Freemasons, the Priory of Sion, and other elusive orders often feature in these theories. Direct evidence is scarce, yet the repetition of symbols and heraldic motifs, along with discrete ties between members and ancient noble families, has fueled the belief that these are the keepers of the memory. They never publicly proclaim a mission to protect the Merovingians. Yet, scattered clues in the architecture of their lodges, in internal documents, or even in the speeches of their leaders are thought to allude to that very purpose. Some of these societies appear to have designed their rituals as a form of coded transmission. To an outsider, they are merely solemn, arcane spectacles. To an initiate, trained in the symbols and the story, they reveal a deeper meaning. This is how a memory can survive for centuries, even when every official institution denies it. Over time, what remained of the Merovingian legacy became an inseparable blend of historical fact, village lore, and esoteric practice. The threads are so intertwined that it is nearly impossible to distinguish evidence from embellishment. Yet this very ambiguity has made the story resilient. It does not need proof to exist. Only the act of being told, remembered, and embedded in forms that people encounter every day without realizing it. From fireside tales in rural hamlets to discreet rituals in shadowed lodges, the Merovingian memory still flows like an underground river through the centuries. And sometimes it surfaces not to reveal the entire truth, but to remind us that there are chapters of history that have never truly slept. By the 19th century, Europe had entered an age of contradiction. On one side, industrialization and empirical science were reshaping society with the precision of modernity. On the other, the Romantic movement was stirring a deep nostalgia, a yearning for the heroic past and the aura of lost legend. This was fertile ground for the Merovingian story, buried for centuries to rise again into public consciousness. In France, once the heart of Merovingian rule, a surge in national historical revivalism sought roots older than the Carolingians or the Capetians. Romantic historians and writers such as Augustin Thierry and Jules Michelet reimagined the history of the Franks, portraying the long-haired kings with dignity and mystery as emblems of an ancient French identity. At the same time, newly founded archaeological societies began excavating royal tombs, including those of Dagobert I and Clovis I, stirring public fascination with a dynasty long excluded from mainstream history. But the Merovingian revival did not remain confined to academia. By the mid-19th century, Europe was teeming with secret societies and occult movements, from the Freemasons and Rosicrucians to smaller esoteric circles. Many of these groups began weaving themselves into legends of the chosen bloodline, hinting or outright claiming that they were the guardians of the Merovingian legacy. Among the most tantalizing names was the Priory of Sion, a shadowy organization said to have existed for centuries, protecting evidence of a bloodline stretching from Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene to the Merovingian kings. Meanwhile, archaeological finds and historical studies were often cloaked in mystique. Certain artifacts, such as jewelry engraved with honeybees or fleur-de-lis, were interpreted as proof that Merovingian symbols had survived deep within French culture. Secret societies were quick to adopt these discoveries, folding them into their own symbolic systems and using them to reinforce the conviction among initiates that they were heirs to a sacred inheritance. In literature and art, the Merovingians returned in romanticized and enigmatic form. Painters recreated the coronation of Clovis III, or portrayed the long-haired kings in solemn profile, but with details absent from historical records. A fish, a cluster of bees, a ripple motif, each a subtle nod to the dynasty's legendary supernatural origins. These visual cues seem designed for an audience fluent in the symbolic language of the esoteric world. The blending of archaeology, romantic literature, and esoteric tradition transformed the Merovingians from a historical dynasty into a cultural phenomenon, a layered symbol that was at once national heritage and a cipher for theories of hidden power and secret bloodlines. By the century's end, the image of the long-haired king had re-entered Europe's collective imagination, not merely as a chapter of history, but as part of an unfinished story. By the 20th century, the Merovingian story had moved beyond the closed circles of secret societies and scholarly journals into an entirely new arena: popular culture. This was the age when print media, radio, and later television began to shape the global imagination on an unprecedented scale. Within that wave, the Merovingian legend was reborn, reshaped, and spread faster than ever before. From the early decades, writers of esoterica began publishing works that linked the Merovingians to some of history's most controversial themes: the origins of Christianity, the legend of the Holy Grail, and the medieval secret orders. These books blended historical research with bold speculation, producing dramatic narratives in which the long-haired kings were not merely temporal rulers, but heirs to a sacred inheritance with the potential to alter the world order. A defining moment came in the 1980s with the publication of Holy Blood, Holy Grail by Michael Begant, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln. Drawing on a mix of historical documents, esoteric traditions, and provocative hypotheses, the book popularized the idea that the Merovingians might be direct descendants of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. Although condemned by mainstream historians, it became a publishing sensation, propelling the legend far beyond the confines of academia and secretive circles. Film and television played their part as well. European and American documentaries on the mysteries of history began including the Merovingians as part of a hidden network of power linking past and present. In fictional works, ancient bloodlines with shadowy influence, along with cryptic codes embedded in architecture and art, often carried the unmistakable imprint of the Merovingian narrative, even if the name itself was altered to suit the story. By the century's end, the rise of the internet provided the perfect medium for these theories to flourish. Online forums, niche websites, and discussion groups sprang up where enthusiasts exchanged images, maps, and symbolic analyses linking the Merovingians to everything from the Knights Templar and the Holy Grail to modern political conspiracies. In this process, the line between fact and fiction blurred more than ever. Unverified details began to take on a life of their own, repeated often enough to become truth in collective memory. The Merovingian story thus became both a cultural phenomenon and a case study in how history, once filtered through the lens of mass media, can mutate and spread beyond anyone's control. All of this laid the groundwork for the leap that would come in the early 21st century, when a single work of fiction rooted in many elements of the Merovingian legend would spark a global frenzy, thrusting the myth before hundreds of millions of people and ensuring that it would never again recede fully into the shadows. In 2003, the release of Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code sent a cultural shockwave around the globe. Within months, the novel had become a publishing phenomenon, selling tens of millions of copies and being translated into dozens of languages. By 2006, the film adaptation brought soaring shots of Gothic cathedrals, Renaissance art, and religious codes to cinema audiences worldwide. Beneath the rapid-fire pacing of its thriller plot lay a hypothesis long circulated in esoteric circles, that the Merovingian bloodline was the direct descendant of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene, and that this truth had been systematically suppressed for centuries. A narrative once confined to secret societies and a small circle of alternative historians suddenly reached hundreds of millions. Elements familiar from Holy Blood, Holy Grail, the Knights Templar, the Priory of Sion, and the Holy Grail as a symbol of bloodline were reimagined by Brown as pieces of an urgent, high-stakes treasure hunt. In doing so, he propelled the Merovingians out of the shadows of historical obscurity and into the center of global popular imagination. This surge offered an unprecedented opportunity for those interested in hidden history. Books, documentaries, and television specials on the Merovingians, the Templars, and related theories multiplied. Places linked to the legend, most famously Rennes-le-Château in southern France, became tourist destinations for both scholars and the merely curious. The chosen bloodline entered cultural life as a mystery, both romantic and controversial, fueling countless conversations in public forums and behind closed doors. Yet the speed and scale of the phenomenon also posed a danger, the risk of the story dissolving into the fog of fiction. For many, the Da Vinci Code was not a gateway to serious research, but an entertainment product. Details invented or exaggerated for the sake of the plot began to overshadow, and sometimes even replace, verifiable historical facts. The blending of evidence and invention blurred the line between scholarship and storytelling, making it easier for both misunderstandings and deliberate distortions to take hold. Religious institutions and mainstream historians responded with strong rebuttals, dismissing the book's claims as baseless sensationalism. Yet, as history has shown, attempts to suppress or discredit a narrative often have the opposite effect. The very act of denouncing the Da Vinci Code only heightened public curiosity, because throughout history, efforts to kill a story have often ensured its survival. In the end, the Da Vinci Code left a double legacy. On one hand, it was the catalyst that made the Merovingian mystery one of the most widely recognized historical enigmas in the world. On the other, it draped the subject in a layer of commercialized fiction that made separating fact from fabrication even more challenging. For seekers of historical truth, it became both a golden opportunity to draw attention and a daunting task to guide audiences through the maze of hypotheses, symbols, and novelistic invention. From that moment onward, the Merovingian legend escaped the control of any single group or scholar. It became common property in the realm of global imagination, an unfinished mosaic to which anyone, from researchers to casual readers, could add a tile of their own. As the Merovingian story stepped into global view, it ceased to be merely a historical mystery. Modern theories began to link this chosen bloodline to the architecture of political and economic power shaping today's world. The core idea is simple. If Merovingian descendants survive, they may have merged into the political and financial elite of Europe and, by extension, the global stage, maintaining influence through marriage alliances and discrete financial networks. In this framework, the survival of the Merovingians does not necessarily imply they are poised to reclaim a throne in the traditional sense. Instead, their influence could manifest through modern channels, board seats at centuries-old banking houses, control over cross-border trusts, or informal advisory roles to governments and international institutions. Some independent researchers point to genealogical overlaps between certain present-day aristocratic families and lineages connected to the Merovingians, arguing that such connections are unlikely to be purely coincidental. Economically, these theories often focus on Europe's historic financial hubs, London, Zurich, Laps, and Luxembourg, where banks with centuries-old histories remain intertwined with aristocratic families or dynasties bound by complex marital ties to royalty. If a surviving Merovingian branch had integrated into these networks, they could indirectly influence global finance, shaping investment flows, currency markets, or the funding of political campaigns. In the political sphere, the theories become more sensitive. Some authors speculate that individuals of Merovingian descent may hold key positions within institutions like the European Union, NATO, or influential think tanks that steer foreign policy. Strategic marriages over generations, combined with a culture of elite networking, allowed them access to the levers of power without requiring direct public visibility. Yet all these theories face the same barrier: a lack of publicly verifiable evidence. Bloodlines can, in theory, be traced through genetic technology, but obtaining DNA samples from ruling or noble families is nearly impossible. Furthermore, any genealogical overlaps without supporting documentation are easily dismissed as coincidence. This absence of proof leaves the hypothesis both contested and alluring, providing fertile ground for speculation and reinterpretation. What is certain is that, in symbolic and cultural terms, Merovingian remains a latent power brand. At diplomatic receptions, closed-door summits, and ceremonial events, invoking a bloodline with deep historical roots can serve as a subtle way of signaling rank. Whether real or imagined, the Merovingian narrative in the context of global politics and economics has become a unique layer of meaning, where history, legend, and the mechanics of influence blend into a network that is difficult to see yet impossible to entirely dismiss. If we were to plot modern European power on a single map, 4 cities stand out: Paris, Brussels, London, and the Vatican, each carrying its own distinct layer of meaning when viewed through the lens of the Merovingian hypothesis. They are not merely capitals or headquarters of international institutions. In many interpretations, they are nodes where currents of political, financial, religious, and symbolic influence converge. Paris, the historic heart of the Frankish kingdom and the modern capital of France, was chosen by Clovis I as his seat of power after uniting the Frankish tribes. Here stands the Basilica of Saint Denis, resting place of France's kings, which occupies a central place in the Merovingian legend. Some researchers claim that the city's architecture and street plans still encode hidden axes and symbols recalling this legacy. Today, Paris remains a political and cultural nexus. Any narrative involving royal bloodlines can find an eager public here. Brussels, the capital of Europe and headquarters of the European Union and NATO, is where decisions affecting hundreds of millions are made. Many Belgian and Luxembourgish noble families have deep marital ties to European dynasties, including branches once connected to the Merovingians. Their presence in Brussels' political and financial life bolsters the idea that this city could be a key link in a power network stretching back to the Middle Ages. London, with its semi-autonomous financial district, the City of London, is a global capital of capital. Here, centuries-old banks and investment houses are often tied through complex histories to European aristocracy. Supporters of the Merovingian hypothesis point out that while London was never under Frankish rule, the dynasty's legacy could have reached into its power structures through marriage alliances and commercial networks. The Vatican, the spiritual epicenter of the Catholic Church, is the most complex node of all. If the Merovingian theory linking the bloodline to Jesus and Mary Magdalene holds any truth, the Vatican would be both a possible keeper of that evidence and the institution with the strongest motive to control or suppress it. The Vatican's secret archives, a labyrinth of tightly guarded documents, have long fueled speculation about what must never be revealed. When these 4 points are connected on a map, some researchers envision a network of both official and unofficial channels, private conferences, trust funds, banking consortia, and even religious or cultural events serving as discrete meeting grounds for those with shared interests or origins. While there is no public proof of such a power quadrangle, the idea that Paris, Brussels, London, and the Vatican form a connected lattice tied to a hidden legacy ensures that the Merovingian theory continues to live in the collective imagination. And in that imagined network, the most intriguing element is not what is displayed openly, but what runs beneath. Connections never recorded in minutes, agreements never declared aloud. It is in the space between the visible lines on the map and the invisible threads beneath that the Merovingian story finds its most enduring foothold. Over the past century, journalists, independent historians, esoteric researchers, and even amateur investigation groups have tried to trace the Merovingian thread within the fabric of modern power. They have combed through genealogies, pored over faded monastic manuscripts, surveyed ancient architecture for hidden symbols, and cross-referenced data on Europe's aristocratic families. Yet, an odd pattern emerges. Most of these efforts stop suddenly, as if an invisible wall were blocking any deeper progress. Some ended for mundane reasons, lack of funding, loss of interest, but others carry a more unsettling tone. Investigators have claimed that files vanished after submitting requests to National Archives, or that key witnesses abruptly withdrew without explanation. In some cases, research teams received discreet advice warning that continuing would create trouble for those involved. One of the most cited examples occurred in the 1970s when a team in southern France claimed to have uncovered a cache of documents linking a local noble family to the Merovingians across centuries. Before they could publish, the entire collection was stolen in a mysterious break-in. The police never found the culprit, and the press coverage quickly faded into obscurity. In more recent decades, researchers have described data disappearances in modern form. Electronic records erased without cause, email archives vanishing from accounts, or entire sets of digital photographs of original documents becoming corrupted. While such events could have mundane explanations, their frequency in this context has formed a pattern too persistent for casual dismissal. It is, of course, impossible to definitively claim a coordinated conspiracy. Yet if the hypothesis of a connection between the Merovingians and contemporary power structures holds any truth, the motive for limiting information would be obvious. Any revelation capable of undermining legitimacy or disrupting long-standing power arrangements would be zealously protected, sometimes by methods far short of open intervention. Ironically, it is the very abandonment or obstruction of these inquiries that keeps the legend alive. In the public mind, each failed project does not disprove the theory. Instead, it reinforces the belief that there must be something worth hiding. Thus, the Merovingian story continues to occupy a suspended state, half fact, half fiction, where every gap is filled by speculation and imagination. Perhaps this is why, if the truth exists, it is unlikely ever to be fully exposed. And yet, in another sense, it is this very ambiguity that ensures the Merovingian narrative will never die, only shift in form, carried forward by each new generation of seekers. Throughout human history, the notion of a chosen bloodline has held a unique magnetism. It merges tangible worldly authority with an intangible aura of sacredness, intertwining inherited genetics with symbolic storytelling. For the Merovingians, this allure is heightened by the mythic layers surrounding their origins. The tale of Meve and the mysterious sea creature, the sacred long hair that could never be cut, the honeybee as a symbol of immortality, whether fact or legend. These elements etched the Merovingians into memory as a dynasty whose right to rule came not only from military strength, but from a supernatural mandate beyond earthly law. The allure of the chosen bloodline rests on a deep psychological need, the human desire to believe in a greater order, one where power is bestowed upon those appointed by fate. In the ancient and medieval world, this belief could stabilize societies, as subjects obeyed the king in an act of obedience to divine will. In the modern era, the sentiment persists in subtler forms, expressed through reverence for old dynasties, royal symbolism, or meticulously preserved genealogies. Yet the very appeal of this idea carries great risk. When a group claims or is believed to possess a chosen bloodline, it can become a tool to legitimize authority, suppress competition, and justify actions beyond common ethical boundaries. History offers countless examples of regimes and political movements exploiting this belief to secure dominance, wage wars, or suppress rivals. In the case of the Merovingians, the danger is amplified by the elusive nature of their narrative. With much of the evidence existing in the murky space between history and legend, verification becomes nearly impossible. This gives those who wish to exploit the story free rein to select only the details that serve their purposes, discard inconvenient truths, and craft a version of reality tailored to political or economic gain. In today's globalized, media-saturated world, such a story can spread at breathtaking speed, capturing hearts before facts can catch up. Its emotional pull, combining historical mystery with mythic grandeur, makes the public susceptible to fascination long before they consider its credibility. In the hands of an organized power bloc, the chosen bloodline could be weaponized to shape public opinion, restructure alliances, or even shift political balances. Thus, the Merovingian legend is not merely a curious historical artifact or an enticing cultural mystery. It is a vivid example of how an idea, regardless of its factual roots, can both fuel the human imagination and wield enough influence to shape and even manipulate societies. And this is precisely why many believe that if the secret of such a chosen bloodline does exist, it will always be protected or buried at any cost. Within the mist that shrouds the Merovingian story runs an undercurrent of prophecy, hazy predictions scattered across monastic manuscripts, fragments of folk legend, verses of mystical poetry, and cryptic texts copied within secret societies. The details shift from one source to another, but they converge on a single idea. One day, the chosen bloodline will return, bringing with it a great transformation. One of the oldest such prophecies is said to have originated in Languedoc in southern France, once a Merovingian stronghold. A 13th century manuscript, still kept in a secluded monastery, speaks of the heir of the sea who will appear when darkness covers the west and the ancient light is awakened. The ancient light is never defined, but many interpret it as a metaphor for the restoration of a forgotten lineage. Later secret societies, particularly those believed to be heirs of the Templar tradition, wove these prophecies into their own rites. In certain closed ceremonies, initiates recite verses or incantations about the hidden king who will emerge to restore order. Here, order does not refer to the laws of the present world, but to a sacred order, a system said to have existed since pre-Christian times, now replaced by prevailing structures of power. Notably, these prophecies often resurfaced during times of European crisis. During the wars of religion, the French Revolution, and even the World Wars, new versions of the prophecy circulated quietly, carrying the message that current upheavals were merely preludes to a greater return. This persistence suggests that whether or not they are historically authentic, such prophecies endure because they answer a deep psychological need in times of uncertainty, the need to believe that a predestined one will arrive to set things right. The vagueness of these forecasts is their greatest strength. Lacking specific dates, places, or names, they cannot be conclusively disproven, nor can they be confirmed. Each generation is free to reinterpret the prophecy in its own context, making it a flexible tool for sustaining belief or advancing political aims. And so the prophecy of the Merovingian return continues to live not only in brittle manuscripts and arcane writings, but also in the imagination of those who believe history has never truly ended. For if the story is true, their disappearance was never the final chapter, only an extended pause before the next one begins. Imagine that one day, in the turbulence of the mid-21st century, a figure steps forward to publicly declare themselves a direct descendant of the Merovingians, and not merely with words. They present an unbroken genealogical record preserved over centuries, royal artifacts matching descriptions in early chronicles, and even DNA analysis cross-referenced with remains from verified royal tombs. Such an event, if it occurred, would trigger a seismic shock not only in academic circles, but across global politics, religion, and media. Politically, reactions would be fractured. In France and in European states that still maintain constitutional monarchies, this could ignite movements for royal restoration or fuel nationalist identity politics. Traditionalists might frame it as an opportunity to restore the sacred order that history once diverted. Conversely, democratic governments would likely work to minimize its political impact, wary of anything that could destabilize the existing order. In countries where monarchy is a sensitive topic, the appearance of such a claimant could even be legally or diplomatically suppressed. Religiously, especially within the Roman Catholic Church, the situation could become far more delicate. If the Merovingian bloodline were demonstrably tied to controversial theories about Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene, it would present a theological earthquake. The Vatican might face an impossible choice: deny and move to discredit the claimant, or attempt to reinterpret and integrate the story into existing doctrine. Either path risks triggering internal schisms between those who embrace the revelation and those who view it as heretical or dangerous. In the media, the event would be a firestorm. Within hours of the announcement, major news outlets would broadcast the story worldwide. Social media would erupt with images, video clips, and endless commentary. Talk shows, documentaries, and dramatizations would appear in rapid succession. The narrative would fracture into hundreds of competing versions, some grounded in fact, others in wild conjecture or outright fabrication. In such an information maelstrom, distinguishing truth from fiction would become almost impossible. There would also be the risk of instrumentalization. Political, economic, and religious factions could all seek to use the Merovingian as a rallying symbol or as a wedge to divide. The individual might be invited to speak at international summits, courted to endorse or oppose key policies, or manipulated as a bargaining chip in discrete negotiations. They could become both a unifying figure and a polarizing one, depending on how they and their handlers chose to navigate the spotlight. Ultimately, the question is whether the modern world, with its entrenched systems of governance, international alliances, and delicate balance of power, could truly accommodate the return of a sacred king, even in symbolic form. Or would such an appearance unleash a cascade of new conflicts where history, religion, politics, and media collide in a storm too chaotic for anyone to control? The Merovingian story has never been purely history. It exists in the liminal space where what can be proven and what can only be believed meet. On one hand, we have firmly recorded facts. The Merovingian dynasty once ruled much of Western Europe for over 2 centuries before being deposed in 751. Royal tombs, artifacts, and certain documents remain, providing a solid historical framework. On the other hand, the flesh covering that framework is drawn from legend, esoteric ritual, prophecy, and unverified theories, where truth and fiction dissolve into each other until they are almost inseparable. It is in this gray zone that the story finds its most enduring life. The absence of absolute proof does not weaken it. On the contrary, it invites imagination to fill in the gaps. Anyone approaching the Merovingian narrative can select their own version of truth to match their belief or purpose. The historian searches archives for fragments. The mystic deciphers symbols. The filmmaker spins it into a screenplay, while the public enjoys it as an unsolved mystery. This is also why every attempt to settle the story fails. When one theory is disproven, it does not vanish. It simply transforms, merging with new fragments and anchoring itself to whatever gaps remain. The gray zone is the perfect ecosystem for legend, open enough for anyone to participate, closed enough that no one can claim a final ending. For the Merovingians, living in this gray zone offers another advantage. It shields the story from total control. If every fact were exposed, the mystery would evaporate. But kept in this half-true, half-false state, it remains both challenging and seductive, continually inviting inquiry. This is the ideal state for a legend to survive the erosion of time, the shifts of politics, and the upheavals of society. The Merovingian tale does not need to be entirely true to hold power. Its strength lies in the questions it forces us to ask about history, about authority, and about how stories are told or hidden. And as long as those questions remain unanswered, the Merovingians will continue to live in the collective imagination, a reminder that the past never fully closes. It only waits to be awakened in a new form. When we look at the Merovingian story through the lens of accessible historical records and archaeology, it is like standing before an ancient painting worn down by time. Some sections remain vivid. The victories of Clovis I, the coronation rites, the sacred long hair, the year 751 when Childeric III was deposed. But between these preserved strokes lie vast gaps where the paint has either flaked away naturally or been deliberately covered over. What we see is the part we are allowed to see, the official chronicles, the artifacts curated in museums, the architectural work still standing. This is the surface layer, safe, filtered, and arranged to form a coherent story according to the standards of accepted history. It is the portion of the painting hung in a well-lit gallery, accessible to all. What we do not see is what has been removed or hidden, documents lost in war, or quietly misplaced from archives, genealogies scrubbed of certain names, manuscripts buried deep in monastic libraries that few are permitted to touch, and oral histories kept alive only within select families or secret orders. These might contain fragments capable of altering the entire picture, or at least compelling us to question the version of history we have inherited. Between these two layers lies a middle ground, faint, ambiguous clues, recurring symbols in architecture, strange patterns in stained glass, alignments of roads and landmarks that connect historical sites in improbable ways. They are like brushstrokes that do not quite fit the visible composition, marks that hint at another painting beneath the surface. To the casual observer, they are coincidences. To the seeker, they are signs that the official picture is incomplete. In the case of the Merovingians, history functions like a canvas deliberately left with missing sections. These gaps represent both the genuine absence of data and a constructed space designed to preserve mystery. They ensure the viewer is never fully satisfied, always hungry for the next fragment, and that hunger itself becomes the lifeblood of the story. Perhaps the greatest danger lies not in what we do not know, but in believing we already see everything, when in truth we are looking only at a portion carefully chosen for display. For once we believe the painting is whole, we stop searching, and that is when the real story does not merely remain hidden. it quietly vanishes. Not through suppression, but through forgetting. Imagine that one day everything concealed about the Merovingians is brought into the open. Their full bloodline, their connection to the Knights Templar, every locked away document, symbol, and piece of evidence from centuries past. If the complete truth were revealed, what would it actually change? Would it shake the political and religious foundations of Europe? Or would it cause only a brief surge of curiosity before fading into the constant churn of the digital news cycle? The initial impact might be a restructuring of how we understand history itself. The core narrative of Europe, the relationship between secular and spiritual authority, the formation of kingdoms, would have to be rewritten, this time with the reemergence of a chosen bloodline long pushed to the margins. In religion, especially within the Roman Catholic Church, any revelation tied to the Merovingian origins could ignite deep theological debate, perhaps even fracture unity. Yet it is equally possible that the most profound effect would not arise from the truth itself, but from how it is received. In an age where misinformation and conspiracy theories spread faster than facts, no amount of proof can guarantee universal acceptance. Some would see it as a historic breakthrough. Others would dismiss it as fabrication or manipulation. In that case, the Merovingian mystery, solved or not, would continue to live on as legend, only in a new form. The final question is not simply what we will know, but what we will do with what we know. Truth can be a light that disperses darkness, but it can also be a fire that burns down the very foundations on which society rests. Are we prepared to face the consequences of seeing the full picture, especially if it forces us to abandon beliefs held for centuries? Perhaps this is the Merovingian story's most enduring essence. It exists to pose questions rather than to provide answers. For that reason, whether the secret is ever revealed or not, it will continue to drive us to examine the relationship between history, power, and memory, forces that, like blood, are always in motion, but not always visible. And so the journey through the mists of Merovingian history comes to a close, at least within the scope of this narrative. But the story, like all great mysteries, lives on not in the history books, but in the questions left unanswered. The past may sleep, but it is never truly silent.